So I am just wanting to say thank you to Lonnie and to Lori for inviting me to do this today. It's nice to actually be in front of people again and not just in front of my computer. But I appreciate the opportunity that we have to have individuals who couldn't be with us here physically, joining in virtually as well too. It's great that we can expand the reach of opportunities like this. So I always like to start with talking just a little bit about, you know, who I am or how I came to have some knowledge about this area. I am a neuropsychologist. I have been practicing for a very long time. And for many of those years, have worked with individuals across the lifespan, individuals who have a variety of different kinds of diagnoses or challenges. The majority of my focus or my time has been in the pediatric world, so children through adolescents, but of course have touched down in other areas as well. So I've done a lot of work in terms especially of the learning and the executive function end of things, which is I think how I came to be asked to do this. And that is not just exclusive with individuals with autism, but in other populations as well. So I just put up here, because I am now in private practice, these are the places that you can find me. My contact information will be at the end as well too. I did want to talk just a bit, like Dr. Brian did, about the language and the terms, because I do also tend to use terms interchangeably, with the idea that there are certain segments of any population that prefer particular terms, and that's not a universal preference. And so I want to just acknowledge that, to say that you will hear me say a variety of, or speak in a variety of different ways. The other thing is that with regard to diagnosis as well, I think that it's important that we acknowledge that not everybody who identifies as being autistic has had a formal diagnosis either. And so we need to be keeping that in mind as well, that even without a formal diagnosis, there's a lot of these kinds of strategies and supports that absolutely can be put into play. I've been given two sort of focuses, foci for the talk this morning, and a short period of time to talk about them, one being learning and one being executive functioning. So I'm going to do my best to touch on both of those. The learning part is going to be quite brief, and a little bit more about the executive functioning, because I think it impacts the learning piece quite substantially. But I did want to mention, when I'm speaking about the learning part, I'm going to be talking about learning in a traditional academic environment, not sort of that incidental learning that we expect individuals to be able to do day to day. And talking about strategies that would be most effective in that environment. And then for executive functioning, I really want to talk about kind of that day-to-day impact or ongoing impact, and then what kinds of supports might be helpful. So I wanted to start with the learning piece, of course, and talk about obstacles to learning that we often find associated with autism. Now, of course, these aren't universal, and everybody presents differently, but we have to take into account that there are communication and language differences. Sometimes it's a matter of an individual who's nonverbal, or sometimes it's an individual who has some challenges with understanding higher level language or figures of speech, for example. That's going to impact those communication pieces as well. Fine motor skills come into play quite a bit in the learning environment. Attention, absolutely. Anxiety, executive functioning, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then, of course, those actual diagnosed specific learning disorders. So a number of individuals with autism also have, say, a specific learning disorder in reading. And so that has to be taken into account, also looking at it through the lens of what does this look like for autism. I just want to talk really quickly with that specific learning disorder piece. Really, we're talking about how it's defined in the DSM, which is our standard method of making those diagnoses. So difficulties learning and using academic skills, symptoms that persist at least 6 months despite targeted intervention. So that is where you have to go at diagnosing that through a formal assessment, psychoeducational assessment. They can be present in reading, in written expression, or in mathematics, or any combination thereof. So yes, autism and specific learning disorders absolutely co-occur. I see it often. And when we're implementing the strategies that we would often use for a child with a specific learning disorder, if that child also has autism, we need to keep that in mind, because there are going to be some of the strategies that we might otherwise have used that aren't going to be as effective for the child who has autism. So you need to really consider what is the full context of the child and how can we uniquely sort of implement those recommendations. Learning strategies and supports. Often we need strategies for learning even when there's no diagnosis of a specific learning disorder present. So we don't want to limit the intervention that we're going to do or the supports we're going to provide if a child doesn't have a formal diagnosis. If we see that they're struggling, they need support. Most often I see this in the work that I do, and my work is predominantly assessment, when the knowledge or what the child has been able to learn moves to applications. So rather than the rote learning pieces that we do early on, like in Division 1, we're learning to read, and in Division 2, read to learn. So it's that idea that it's not necessarily the decoding, they understand how to read the words, but then as the demands start to increase, the challenge starts to become more in terms of comprehension, actually understanding what it is that they're reading. They can read words at beyond a grade 12 level when they're 7, but they're not understanding what it is that they're reading. Or I see this one time and again, spelling is excellent, but they can't get their ideas down on paper. There's this disconnect between what I know and how I can get it down on paper. And then also I see it with math, reasoning versus operations. So I can add, subtract, multiply, divide like nobody's business. But when it comes to doing word problems, or when it comes to reading a word problem and figuring out what you want me to do with this, that's then where the challenge starts to come into play. So really what I'm saying here is we really need to look at or appreciate where is the barrier for the child. Or learner. They can be adult learners too, of course. So as I said, understanding that link between the challenge and then the autism piece. So if we look just really at reading comprehension as being one of the areas, there's lots of different things that might come into play why reading comprehension is challenging for the person. Is it because they're having difficulty with inferencing? So if I ask a factual question about what you read, they've got it, they know it. But if I want them to read between the lines, they don't know how to pull that information out. They can't put it together in the same way as when it's written right there. Or is it more that there are figures of speech or higher level language that's being used in that passage? So when we look at fiction versus nonfiction, that's often a challenge because of the way that the words are used, and they're used in ways that may not come as naturally or be as understood as naturally for the individual with autism. Or is it the fact that, guess what? There's a lot of information on that page and I'm reading through it. And as I'm reading through it, I'm getting overloaded. I can't hold on to all of that information to then be able to use it when you ask me a question, which is more that working memory kind of component. So really, what is it that's potentially driving this? It can be multiple different pieces. But the sort of supports or interventions we would use really rely on us figuring out what is it that's driving that particular difficulty. The other thing that's important is what are the key learning goals? So when we're talking about what strategies are helpful, do we want the individual to show us an understanding of the material, or do we want them to be able to write a proper essay? So if it's, I want you to be able to write a proper essay, then let's start with How do we construct a sentence? What does a paragraph look like? What is the structure? Let's use things like graphic organizers. Let's help the individual sit down, generate those ideas, get them into an organizer, and then start to translate that over. And can we use any kind of technology to support that as well too? If the actual intent of the exercise or the assignment is, can you show that you understand how caterpillars metamorphosize into butterflies, then you don't necessarily have to write me a paragraph. Can you draw me a diagram? Could you do me a PowerPoint? So are there ways that we can look at how do we get the same kind of information out of somebody in a way that really resonates for them, or a way that really works for them? And then for any student, but I find in particular for autistic students, if we can increase their engagement or their interest, we get far better work. And so part of that is there anywhere that we can make a choice about, what is the book that you're going to read, or what is the topic that we're going to be researching? Is there a different way to demonstrate the learning? Like I said, with using the PowerPoints, doing a diagram, what have you. And then again, use of technology is just so, it's life-changing, really. So when I've been doing this for well over 20 years. And at the beginning of my career, it was like, you did not have access to any sort of technology. And then there was those, I'm going to say the wrong term, but they were like a speak and spell kind of contraption that was available for some students, but it was really hard to get them for them. And they would only print out like a sentence at a time, and super frustrating. So the introduction of technology into learning and supporting people has made such a huge difference. And I think, I recognize that there is sometimes a bit of a hesitation to use some of the technology. But I do think that really we're looking at a situation where a lot of our learners are going to be adults in a world where technology is even more fully integrated than it is now. So we're actually building skills that are going to be helpful for them moving forward. The other thing I want to touch on really quickly is, how do we support what I call learning adjacent challenges to autism? So it's not the learning kind of component itself, but these other pieces that can come up against learning or impact learning or make learning much more challenging. So physical, we've talked a little bit about communication and fine motor sorts of challenges. Regulation is huge. And I think, there's lots of times that I am working with students doing an assessment or working in a classroom or what have you. And it's really clear that, the child is dysregulated, they're overwhelmed. How do we expect them to do learning when they're overwhelmed? So what are the ways that we can start to look at what is it that's overwhelming them? Is it a sensory sort of thing where we can just, have lower lights, or can they put on sensory or put on noise canceling headphones? Is there something like that that we could use to help with that piece? And then, of course, refusals become more and more challenging the older students get. And I've worked a number of times in the recent past with teens, and parents are really, really struggling to get them out the door, to get them to school. And it becomes a huge challenge. And then also the refusals to complete non-preferred tasks over preferred tasks. So how do we kind of find that balance? And it all leads into that executive function piece, at least in my experience or my opinion. I'm just going to pop this up really quick. Suggested resources, the top two websites, these are good for any learner. The Mass Dictionary for Kids has great printables and visual resources for math. The LD Online, it's an American site, but it's got great resources across the board for learning disorders, really usable information. And then you'll see with my next slide that has resources as well. I really love the work that Dawson and Gare do, and they've got a variety of different print resources that have really great information about, how do you actually deal with some of these sorts of challenges in a classroom or outside the classroom too. So I'm going to move on really quickly, and I know I've already talked too much as it is. So executive functioning, I'm not going to go into the definition other than to say that there's lots of different definitions out there, lots of ideas about what it is. I call it an umbrella term. It's executive functioning, but it's all of these other functions underneath of that. I also sometimes in my darker moments call it a garbage can because it's just this thing that we throw all these terms into. But really what it is it's actually what we need to be able to engage in day-to-day kinds of behaviors, goal-directed and regulating. And so you'll see in this slide, it's goal-directed thought, goal-directed behavior, regulating that behavior. So some of the skills that are really important are being able to inhibit, being able to monitor, to evaluate, to solve problems, and then to be able to be flexible, shifting those strategies and solutions. So the key areas that I usually talk about or usually consider falling under that umbrella or in that garbage can, whichever we prefer, are the ones listed here. I won't have time to talk about all of them, but what I'm going to do is just talk about a couple of the key ones in a minute. I wanted to start first by saying that in order to really be able to support executive functioning, we need to understand how it develops and that it is a developmental progression. We don't expect fully functioning executive skills to be on board in our preschoolers. We start to see precursor skills, but they develop over the course of time throughout childhood, into adolescence, and even in early adulthood. And that has to do with the way that our brains develop. And our frontal lobes being the area that most of these executive functions are controlled by or regulated by, our frontal lobes aren't fully myelinated until we're in our early 20s. And so we don't expect full executive function until that point in time. So our brain development actually runs counter to what our society often expects. There's this expectation that by the time you're 17, 18, you're an adult, you're good to go, and not so much. And being a parent of somebody who's going to turn 18 in January, I can attest to that in my household. I'm thinking we're looking more like mid-20s before that's developed, but that's another story. I think that executive functioning in autism is a huge component, and one that we really do need to look at when we're supporting individuals who are on the autism spectrum. I often think about executive functions as being, are they underdeveloped or are they overdeveloped? And what I mean by that is in a certain situation. So for example, some of the children I work with have a real strong adherence to routines and get really stuck on those routines and those schedules. So it's almost like an overdevelopment of that planning, organizing part, but then an underdevelopment of the ability to be flexible. And those two things come into conflict. Or for example, the child or individual who has a very high sensitivity to certain tastes, textures, clothing, but yet, and so they're really aware of those body sensations, but they're not aware of when they're hungry. So it's an over-awareness of one aspect and an under-awareness of another. So you kind of get this weird or challenging, double-sided piece to try and work through or work around. And then also there's the idea that executive function is going to interact with other areas of cognition. So is there a co-occurring ADHD? Is there anxiety? Those are things that are also going to impact or have a overlap with that executive function system as well. And the idea really is that strategies that you're implementing or trying to use can impact more than one system or more than one challenge at the same time. So we might be moving to try and work on organization, but in working on organization, we're also going to be touching down on some inhibition, some self-regulation, some of those other sorts of working memory pieces. So it's not just one function. So the idea being, I always say to families or teachers when I work with them, what's the one thing you want to try? What's the one thing you want to start with? We can all do one thing. Doing 10 things, forget it. It's too much. It's too much for most of us. What is one thing? So let's start with that one thing, because you'll see doing one thing can actually result in that domino effect. I also just really quickly want to say that we need to consider the developmental level. Again, back to that idea of, is it too little? Is it too much? And then this idea of the external brain. And I know it's actually a term that lots of people don't like. I like it as a neuropsychologist, with just the idea that sometimes my brain doesn't do what I want it to do. And I need some kind of external function to help my brain do what it needs to do. And so that's where I think about that external brain. It's just a support piece where what we're really talking about is, how do we modify the environment? How do we modify what the demands are, or how do we make them more realistic? And by starting externally, then we build that capacity internally, or we help the individual to show their skills more effectively. The other thing that's really important with executive functioning is we need to teach the skill. We can't just expect the person to get it. Even quote unquote typical learners, we need to be really specific sometimes in what it is that we want them to learn, and to support them or coach them through that. Some children learn by just watching. Lots of them don't. So take the example of learning to ride a bike. Some people, very few people, can grab that bike, get on it, and be able to balance and ride right away. Most of us need some degree of support to be able to do that, or some degree of practice to be able to do that safely and effectively. So the idea is that we want to support the learning, not just hand over the bike and say, hey, go to it. You saw me ride down the street. You need to do it now. It doesn't work like that. And then again, the developmental and cognitive level, we're going to have a different expectation for a 5-year-old, an 11-year-old, 16-year-old. And then again, what is the expectation we have based on the full picture of the child? So the developmental level, what is the context we're working in? What are some other co-occurring kinds of challenges? So really, again, just what are all of those pieces that we need to take into mind? And do my recommendation is always a step-by-step approach. And you want to provide enough support for the individual to be successful. And then the other thing is, we want to simplify things, because the more we can take a load off or make tasks simplified, the more likely the individual is to be successful. And then we can add complications in later. And I've got down here the note of the example of clean underwear in the laundry. And I have to admit that I read this one day somewhere online, and I never did write down where I got it from, but it resonated with me so much, and I kind of carried it forward over the years. But the idea being that you want your child, your adolescent, to have clean underwear to wear to school. We also want to teach them to be able to do their laundry. So is it important that they are, sorting their laundry into lights and darks? Or is it important that the laundry gets into the machine and gets done and gets out again, and it's in a basket? Is it important then, once it's in the basket, that it goes back into cupboards or shelves or drawers? Or can they just pull it out of the basket and use it there? Like, how can we simplify this? If our goal is clean underwear, how can we do that in the least possible steps in helping them to be able to do that? So what are the least possible steps? I want to just use this as an example, and then I'll kind of probably slide over the remaining slides. But I always talk about how, again, this is another idea of this simplification, or what goes under, what goes behind any specific task. I tell my child to clean his room. Clean your room to me is very simply like, pick up the laundry, get it in the laundry, put your stuff away, get your toys off the floor, take dishes downstairs, make your bed. Pretty simple, right? No. It's about 25 different things that I'm asking him to do. And so what is the desired end result? So when I'm simplifying that and I'm looking at it, my desired end result is that his laundry gets done and the dirty dishes get out of there. So those are going to be the two primary things. If his bed isn't made, whatever, he's just going to get in it tonight and rumple it up again. And that's not a hill I'm going to die on. Maybe it's a hill you die on. That's okay. Whatever it is, that's most important to you. So what are the, one or two pieces that we want to focus on here? And then what are the barriers to why the individual is having difficulty with clean your room? Is it initiation? So I don't even know where to start, so I'm not going to start. So I need to go in there with you and I need to say, okay, first thing is, see those socks and underwear on the floor, they go in that white basket, and direct them to do that. And then the next thing being, is it a planning and organization kind of piece where there's not a spot that usually is used for things? So can we go and do that? Everything has a spot or a place for everything. Is it more of a problem solving reasoning piece of it? Like I start to do this and then I get stuck and I don't know what the next thing I should do is. And so I just don't do anything else and I wait. Is it more of a working memory thing where there's just too much going on in my head at this time? I'm juggling too many pieces. I can't get it all done. So again, that's where we simplify it to what is the one thing I want you to do? Is it a flexibility shifting set thing? I was putting my socks away and I need to keep putting my socks away. And I came up and I saw there was a plate on the floor and now I'm stuck because do I now move to getting my dishes because that was the other thing I was supposed to do, or do I keep doing my socks? And what do I do? Inhibiting, I am a similar kind of thing. I've got the plate in my hand. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to do the plate. And then I'm downstairs because I took the plate downstairs and now I'm off and doing something else and way off track. Self-regulation. It's frustrating. Any of these tasks that we don't like to do can increase that kind of an emotional response. So often some support for that self-regulation and positive self-talk needs to come in there. And then self-monitoring. Often individuals have difficulty kind of taking that metacognitive perspective of, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Am I on the right track? That kind of checking in on themselves from that point of view. And so it may be that they need that adult support to be checking in to making sure they're on the right track. So I've talked a little bit about all of these sorts of pieces already. The one that I just want to emphasize is that need to do versus nice to do. And that honestly is a mantra that I use every single day. Is it need to do or is it nice to do? Is it a hill I'm going to die on? And when I've got time, the nice to do's are awesome. When I don't have time, it's only the need to do's that get done. I know I'm basically out of time, so I'm just going to run through really quickly just to say that working memory is an area that I find really often for individuals with autism is challenging. I always talk about you want to take information out of their brain, reduce the load in their brain, put it in their environment. Where do you look for the information? Where can I go to find the information? What are the visuals? What are the, calendars and lists and all of those sorts of pieces so I can look in my environment for it and I don't have to keep it in my head. And then making things as routine as possible actually reduces a load on working memory because you always know what to expect or what the next step is. You're not trying to figure that out as juggle it in your head as you're going. Planning and organizing, really, there's lots of different strategies out there for planning and organizing just in general. And what I suggest in this case is what will work for the person that you're trying to support with this. If there's somebody who likes to color code things, then use color codes. If they're somebody who likes to have certain things in certain places, then you assign certain places in your home to be able to hold certain items so that you always know where they are and you get them into the routine of doing that sort of thing. So there's lots of different ways to do this. There's some really awesome apps out there now that help with list making and being able to help you kind of like prioritize lists and stuff. Goblin Tools is one that's free. And then self-regulation, obviously another huge piece. And for this one, self-regulation involves multiple different pieces of executive functions. And really here we have to look at what is causing that challenge with self-regulation. Is it more about factors in our environment? Is it the sensory piece of things? Is it mood or emotional pieces? Is it what is happening that's making the individual have that difficulty with regulation, especially if they're not able to share with us why? There is some research that says that using mindfulness strategies can be really helpful for individuals with autism. So it's something to look into that way as well. And I am going to just stop because I know my time is up. So that is nice to do, not need to do, obviously.